Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and in this brief video I will discuss the subtle differences between literary theory and literary criticism. Quite a few of you have asked me to create this video where I can distinguish between what do we mean when we say literary theory and what do we mean when we say literary criticism. And my hope is that by the end of this video you will be at least clear about the distinction between the two. Now I'm using the definition of literary theory, and I'll put it right on the screen for you, from INternet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, because I think they do a good job of giving us a succinct definition of it. And what they say is literary theory, and I'm quoting here, is the body of ideas and methods we use in the practical reading of literature. By literary theory, we refer not to the meaning of a work of literature, but to the theories that reveal what literature can mean. So literary theory is a description of the underlying principles, one might say the tools by which we attempt to understand literature. Okay, so what that clarifies then is that, first of all, literary theory is a body of ideas and concepts. These concepts don't necessarily talk about an individual text, but they could be about the genre, what is a novel, what constitutes a lyrical poem, anything that tries to describe the act of reading itself, what does it involve, or what constitutes a literary text, how does language work, how do we live as social beings and construe meaning. So all these philosophical, sociological, and even psychological ideas are part of literary theory because they talk about the texts and how they are constituted, the authors and how do they write, and the readers as to how do the readers approach a given text and read it, right? So that in one way or the other would constitute literary theory. Okay. Now, if you look at the contemporary field of literary theory, it is really broad because we can draw from Marx, we can draw from sociology, anthropology. If you look at just post-colonial studies, the post-colonial theories allow us to look at colonialism, its histories, the kind of human subjectivities that were created. All of that theory then bears upon the act of reading a text, right? And so that is the body of knowledge, the philosophies, the ideas that inform our practice of reading literary texts and writing about them. Now, if we go to what is literary criticism, so literary criticism traditionally was when a critic read a text, words on a page, and tried to interpret it, right? And they would go into the nuances of the form and the content and how the language worked, and then interpret the meaning of a text. That was the practice of literary criticism, right? And the distinction was that they are working within the text, with its mechanics or with its form, in order to construe meaning. That is what traditionally was called classical literary criticism. So a succinct definition of literary criticism, also from the same source, INternet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is that traditional literary criticism, prior to the rise of new criticism in the United States, tended to practice traditional literary history, tracking influences, establishing the canon of major writers in the literary periods, and clarifying historical context and allusions within the text. Right? So if you go by that definition, anytime you're just working with the text, right, placing it within its own historical background, its place in the canon, or evaluating its effectiveness and all, you are performing a form of literary criticism. right? But anything that questions the text itself, its validity, its canonicity, right, and the act of reading itself, how does language work in the world, and what do we bring to a text, would be based in literary theory. So technically you could say that at this point where we are, there is hardly any literary criticism that is not informed by theory, right? Because we live in a post-linguistic turn world, post-Foucauldian, Derridean, Marxian world. So by and large, that traditional form of literary criticism where you just stayed on the text as a new critic and maybe challenged the form or talked about the form or had this belief system that text is organic whole, maybe those are no longer possible. So in my opinion, pure form of literary criticism detached from theory, I don't think so it is possible, even though people do claim that they do it, right? And even when they are doing it, when they are reading a text carefully and pointing to the nuances of language, after all, their consciousness and their interpretation is informed by the theoretical understanding of language or the modes of reading. So, to sum up, literary theory then is the body of knowledge, ideas, concepts, philosophies that inform our reading habits, our writing habits, and can sometimes be used to read a text differently. For example, me reading Heart of Darkness using post-colonial theory will read it differently because I'll be looking at the racialized aspects of the text, the latent and blatant racism in the text, whereas a literary critic who doesn't use theory might just look at how the text itself works, right, and not pay attention to the race, not pay attention to the silences of the African voices in it. That's the difference that theory makes, right? And you can apply it to feminism or any other theory that approaches the text from that philosophical or political point of view. And literary criticism, pure and simple, would be anything that involves an act of interpretation, reading the text as an arrived object, right? And not necessarily looking at the ideology of the text or the philosophy of reading itself, but just taking the text as stable and then trying to explain it. So these are my ideas on the distinction between literary theory and literary criticism. I hope it was useful. I will try to develop maybe a more elaborate series on it later, but I think this briefly does answer the question as to the distinction between literary theory and literary criticism. Thank you so much. I will now see you next time, and until then, peace and love.